I'm here today with Gerald Bradley. Gerald is the author of the book Benefit Realisation Management, a practical guide to achieving benefits through change. Gerald has been pioneering and developing the thinking on benefits realisation for 20 years. He founded Sigma as a consultancy and training organisation to focus exclusively on benefit realisation management. Gerald, welcome.
Thank you.
Gerald, I'd like you to just set the scene for us and provide a brief overview of what benefit realisation management is.
Benefit realisation management, or BRM as we often refer to it, is essentially a process for achieving maximum benefits from change within organisations. But it actually starts, which is often not the normal way that people operate, it starts with working with the organisation to establish the end goal, which might be expressed as a vision or a set of quite specific objectives or even some quite clear end benefits. And then it works back from that to determine what kinds of change need to be made. So as it works back through that path, it's kind of creating a route map from where we are today to where we want to be in maybe 2, 3, 5, or 10 years' time. And as it creates that map, it will identify a lot of what we call intermediate benefits, which are steps on the way to the ultimate end benefits or objectives or vision as the end goal. As part of this process, there are techniques for then prioritizing paths in the map and being able then to prioritize solution options. But primarily, it's starting with that end position, working back, and then determining the changes that are required. Whereas so often in organizations, people come up with a solution, which may be new systems, new buildings, new technologies, and some other kinds of change, and then hunt for benefits to justify that investment. We're trying to turn that round completely in this process and say, what are the benefits you want? Where do you want to be in so many years' time? And then working back to determine the required changes that are needed in order to take you down that path. Now, as you go down the path, obviously we want to be able to measure the changes are being delivered, but also that the benefits are being realized as we go through over time. So also a key part of the process is to have identified measures to track these, but also to value the whole of this so that it can also serve as part of the justification process that is generally required to release the funding.
Gerald, why did you feel the need to write a book on benefits realisation management?
Well, that's an interesting question because it wasn't actually my idea to write the book. I was approached by Gower, and it came a bit out of the blue, to say, would I write the book on benefit realisation management? I think I was obviously a recognised authority in the area, and they approached me to write the book. And I had to spend a little while thinking, well, do I want to? I mean, there's pros and cons to this in that once you publish, then you're making all your tools, techniques, approach available publicly to the world. And did I want to do that or not? And I decided actually that I did because, one, I was really keen that far more organizations that I was actually reaching would be able to benefit from the approach, both nationally and internationally. And that has certainly happened subsequently. But the other thing is, it did, in a sense, give me credit for the approach. It's very difficult to patent or even copyright the methodology or parts of the methodology. It's just a nightmare to try and do that. Whereas this way, at least it's published and I can be credited with the whole approach. But at the same time, people can use it and get value from it, which seemed to me, in the end, the best of both worlds.
Gerald, what are the benefits of benefit realisation management to an actual business transformation program?
Well, in some ways, I think the approach gives the greatest value for business transformation. I mean, if I take the other end of the spectrum where you've got, say, an infrastructure project, and obviously there are many infrastructure projects, the value of BRM is far less at that end of the spectrum than in a business transformation. And I think one of the strengths of the approach, or one of the values of the approach, is that it helps to shape what kind of change is needed. So in terms of transformation, it would help to an organization to articulate, first of all, why they want to transform. And then it would help to ultimately maximize the benefits realized. But throughout, it's recognizing the needs of different stakeholders. A key part of the process, which I didn't mention when I was giving the overview, is that it engages stakeholders throughout the whole life cycle of change, recognizing the different needs. This is stakeholders often both within the organization, but sometimes outside the organization, who are going to be affected by the proposed transformation, proposed change, and so on. But within the transformation area, it will help determine or optimize, if you like, the different change solutions. And so I think there are so many different ways in which it would add value to transformation.
Why do you think BRM is often missing in transformation programs, Gerald?
I think probably the reason for that is a lack of understanding of what BRM actually is. I think so many organizations see benefit realization or benefit realization management far too narrowly. Some see it very much focused around justifying an investment. Others go a bit further than that and see it as a kind of tracking and reporting of benefits towards the end of a change. Whereas I think the really biggest value is actually in shaping and scoping the investment by starting to apply the process at the idea stage and not much further on in the life cycle. I know that when I wrote my MSP companion guide on benefit realization management, which had to, because of being an MSP publication, had to go to review to many people around the country. And one of the responses to that was from a strategy manager in one of the police forces, and he said of the early draft that I didn't make enough of the power of the methodology to scope and shape an investment in change to get the optimum benefits and value for the organization. So obviously I responded to that and made the adjustment.
Gerald, what types of benefits should be tracked and why?
Well, I think really the whole range of benefit types, which are quite numerous, should be tracked. And in fact, I would generally recommend a high percentage of the benefits you're looking for should be tracked. That doesn't mean that they've got to be measured in meticulous detail always, although some may need to be. But some you just need a good indication that you're actually making the improvement, or you're moving in the right direction, or achieving what you need to. And in fact, from experience, I would say the majority of benefits with change programs are actually non-financial. They're not real money movements in or out of the organization, which is how we define financial. Possibly as many as 80 or even 90% may be non-financial. But if these are not tracked, then the often later financial benefits that the organization is primarily looking for will not be achieved. So it's vital that people don't just focus on the financial benefits.
And what measures can be used to track benefits, Gerald?
Well, again, the measures can be a whole variety of things. I mean, I try to get organizations to look at those things or look at the data that they're already capturing, usually electronically or automatically in some form or other, and utilize those as much as possible because that keeps the cost down. But I mean, sometimes you're going to have to conduct surveys and take some subjective measures, which can still be very powerful in determining that you're moving in the right direction. But, I mean, we also make a distinction between metrics, which tend to be the raw data that organizations capture, and measures which are computed from this raw data, the metrics, in order to create things that will be reported on regularly in order to demonstrate the realization of the benefit.
Gerald, can you describe a typical approach for benefit tracking and reporting?
Well, in terms of tracking and reporting, we tend to work from the maps that I've talked about earlier, primarily the benefit dependency maps, which have not only got the changes and enablers in, but all the earlier intermediate benefits. And as we track and move through the intermediate benefits, we eventually get to the ultimate benefits or end benefits, which are often where the more senior management are focused. But often there are middle management who are interested in some of the intermediate benefits along the way. And we would encourage, at least one measure for most of the intermediate benefits. Sometimes there's a need for more than one, maybe two or even possibly three measures, depending on the nature of the benefit that you're tracking. And sometimes you need what we'd call complementary measures, because one on their own might just lead to the wrong extreme. To give you a couple of examples, if you just measured, say, average response time, that could be falling. It might fall from 4 seconds to 3.5 seconds, which is hardly discernible by a caller or a user. But if the longest response time actually increased from 2 minutes to 15 minutes, that would be very noticeable by a user. And so sometimes you may want to measure the longest response time as well as the average response time in order to check that you're actually moving in the right direction. That's an example of what I call complementary, or sometimes people call them opposing measures. Now, in terms of tracking and reporting, if you're reporting a lot of data, it can be overwhelming. And I know most organizations use a RAG, red, amber, green status, for highlighting those that are on track and those that are well off track, and use that to get people to just look at those things which need attention. And we would encourage that, except that we'd add a blue as well, and actually apply it to the benefit dependency maps, so that as you move through from left to right, i.e. move through in time, then you'll be monitoring whether they're blue, green, amber or red. Now the blue we feel is very necessary, because in the early stages not all benefits obviously are going to be achieved or even start to improve, and so we use blue to indicate not expected yet. And so we've got the brag, blue, red, amber and green. And it's very powerful because it's very visual as applied to the map. You can see the ones that are blue, not yet to be achieved. You can see the ones that have already gone green. And then if there are any red ones, then that needs investigation and probably immediate action.
Gerald, in the book you talk about BRM relating to typical documents. Can you describe what those documents might be?
Well, I think BRM relates to most program management and many project management documents. It particularly helps to develop and populate what MSP call the blueprint, the future operational state. It's obviously the fundamental part, or it provides most of the input to things like a benefit realization plan, which in itself will go alongside and support and justify the business case. In the early stages of looking at a potential investment, it will help to populate the program mandate. Now, individual items, whether you call them whole documents or not, like benefit profiles and stakeholder profiles, clearly it's going to provide almost all the information. Well, it will provide all the information for both those documents, which the benefit profile being the repository of all information relating to an individual benefit, and the stakeholder profile is looking at the benefits, disbenefits, changes, and enablers that relate to a particular stakeholder group over time. But the stakeholder profile is not a program document, although that's how MSP describe it, incorrectly I think. It's a portfolio document, because obviously any stakeholder will want to know the impacts they're likely to experience or be responsible for, not just from one program, but from all the programs that might impact them.
Gerald, you touched upon benefit realization plans just then. Can you tell us what a benefits realization plan looks like?
I think it should start by setting out very clearly, what are we trying to achieve? Why are we doing this? With some kind of possibly a vision statement, but some very clear objectives and an objectives map, often referred to as a strategy map, that shows how the objectives link together, and often there shows how they're tied into the objectives of the organization. So that's the kind of the backdrop, the fundamentals of why we're doing it and where does it fit. Then the next level of detail, it should include a set, and there's usually at least 3 or 4, benefit dependency maps, which is the more detailed information about benefits, changes and enablers that relate to each one relating to usually a single objective, but which has become identified in the earlier map, the objectives map, as one of the bounding objectives of the program. So that kind of sets the ground and sets the scene for then obviously a complete analysis of the benefits with various different classifications, how they're going to be valued, how the values are going to be predicted, or how targets are set, who's going to be beneficiaries of those, who are going to be owners of the benefits and responsible for delivering the benefits. And of course they will be looking for the single sheet, which is how we would recommend it, benefit profile that I referred to just a few minutes ago, for each benefit, so that they know exactly what they're monitoring, what they're responsible for, and maybe who they need to go and kick if things are not happening. And then what is the benefit tracking mechanism being used? And it may be partly tabular, although the recommendation that I've just been talking about is using this blue, red, amber and green monitoring as we move through the benefit dependency maps. The benefit profiles would probably form an appendix of such a document, but they would be providing the value expected from the program or the project, and therefore would sit alongside the costs of the enablers and changes to give you the business case.
In the book, Gerald, you go into benefits realization management process in some detail. Could you just briefly summarize what a good BRM process should consist of?
Yes, I think it's actually fairly simple. I mean, we tend to talk about it in 6 phases, which was also very similar to a document in I think it was the 2007 version of MSP. Essentially, it's the first phase is about getting the top management commitment, whatever level that is appropriate, agreeing a vision if there is one, determining the high-level objectives and showing how they relate to the business objectives, and maybe identifying how this is going to feed any of the organization's key performance indicators. So that would be phase 1, checking that there is that buy-in of the senior stakeholders. And we see that as quite a short exercise, probably mainly driven by a half-day workshop. And then if that's making sense as an idea, then we would move into phase 2, having had some kind of sign-off brief review. Yes, we think this is the right way to go. It does fit with the organization's objectives. There is buy-in. So let's move then to phase 2. Now, phase 2 is where we take the bounding objectives that have been identified in phase 1, and then for each of those, and usually we're talking about 2, 3 or 4, for each of those we would create one of these detailed maps, first of all identifying all the benefits. And this is working back from the end objective. So we're working back to effectively where we are now today and what we need to do to begin to deliver some of those early benefits. And that would be the second part of this second phase, would be to identify the changes, the things we need to do differently in order to begin to deliver the benefits that we've identified in this map. I mean, when we first create the map, we're basically considering 2 things. One is the operational environment in which we're working, and the other is just logic. And it's only later that we look at costs and risks, or whether we think it's just in someone else's scope and not our own. So that's phase 2. Phase 3, having identified then the benefits and the changes in phase 2, and again had a brief review and checked that people are comfortable that we continue, then we begin to look at, okay, what would be involved in delivering these changes? And that's the stage that we'd normally be thinking about setting up the program team and the program board or project team and board, and beginning to look at the more detailed measures for the benefits that were identified in the previous phase. So we're throughout, as we go around this, it's a 6-phase process. We are engaging with stakeholders throughout the whole 6 phases. In phase 1, it's senior management. In phase 2, it's the next levels of more middle business management. And then, of course, we're engaging with program managements and establishing the senior responsible owner and other key individuals in phase 3. I mean, the end of phase 3, if it hasn't already happened, would include a full business case, so that the more significant expenditure, which usually is to follow, is justified and is focused correctly and not over elaborate, so that we want to make sure it's just fit for purpose and not all bells and whistles. So those are the 3 main phases in terms of BRM and planning. We do have a 4th phase, which is still driven by BRM to optimize the solution option, which has already been broadly determined by the end of phase 3. But sometimes there are still options, the sequence in which you roll things out, the sequence in which you load up data from old systems. These things all these decisions should be benefit driven, because they can make an enormous amount of difference to the overall return. So that's a fairly small phase, almost an extension of 3. Phase 5 is actually implementing all the changes, and that's in the whole realm of management of change. And phase 6 is just pulling together all the measurement, which has probably started in phase 3 and continued through 4 and 5, pulling it all together to check that actually the end goal and the vision is being delivered, and if not, what kind of action needs to be taken to plug any gaps.
Gerald, we've been talking about good practice and the process behind that good practice, but as we both know, a lot of organizations haven't embraced benefits management for one reason or another. What are the challenges of embedding BRM in an organization for the very first time?
Well, first of all, I think embedding as an organization, I think we need to understand that this normally would involve quite a bit of cultural change. Although I think BRM is common sense, sadly, it's not common practice. And so people need to change their attitudes. I mean, there's still a very strong attitude that says, okay, we think we need this, we've come up with a solution, we'll hunt for some benefits to justify it. In our view, that's totally the wrong way round. We should be looking for the end goal that the business needs, the benefits that we're driving for, and then determine what kind of solution we need. And although that sounds simple, that for many organizations, that's quite a big cultural shift. Now, it doesn't mean we can't achieve a lot of quick wins and early value along the way, but before we've fully embedded it in the organization, I think we're talking 3, 4, or even 5 years. So that needs to have the commitment of senior management, and that needs to be sustained over that period. But of course, with the kind of climate we're living in, the tyranny of the urgent comes along and really tends to knock a lot of this out of the water, and people lose focus even if you've managed to achieve that top level commitment at the start. And I mean, you've got people in the organization who say, oh, why do we need to do this extra stuff? Why do we need to go to a benefits workshop? We've never done it before, so why do we need to do it now? Well, of course, the simple answer to that is most of the time in the past you've never achieved more than about 10 or 15% of potential benefits. And we're looking now for something which is dramatically better than that.
Gerald, some of these organizations might have the best of intents in terms of embedding BRM, but what are the typical pitfalls that many organizations will fall into when attempting to embrace BRM for the first time?
I think the main pitfall is, I've observed as people start to move along the path, and then they suddenly think, well, this is more time consuming than we thought, or it is more difficult than we thought, and surely we can cut lots of corners and do something much simpler. And most generally speaking, they can't. I mean, obviously there are situations where that might be possible, but I mean, if we're talking about major programs and we're talking of perhaps costs running into millions, then it's not at all unreasonable that there is a significant focus, both in terms of time and cost, on making sure that the benefits are achieved. But I think that needs a lot of education, because I think people accept that if you're building a very complicated computer system, you need very detailed specifications, and it's going to take a long time, and you've got a lot of testing and all the other things to go on. That seems to be fairly well accepted. The equivalent in looking at benefits isn't accepted, isn't understood. People think that, oh, come on, we'll just measure a few benefits at the end and that'll be fine. I suppose it's lack of education that leads to this.
Gerald, there are some organizations that like the concept of benefit management, but are very driven by wanting to see a pound note figure underneath every single benefit. What's your message to those organizations?
This is a very important question, because it is a significant issue with many organizations. And in fact, I devote a whole chapter in my book on this very subject, because I think there's important message to get across. The first thing I would say is that if you give financial values to non-financial benefits, they're kind of pseudo-financial values, you actually distort the picture. It's a kind of smokescreen, and it leads to lots of double counting and lots of wrong focus. Because if you think of the map where you've got all these cause and effect benefits leading ultimately to usually financial benefits at the right-hand end, if you've given all the benefits along the way financial benefits, you're adding them up and you're into multiple double counts. In fact, one of the values of the maps is that you can reduce or eliminate double counting of financial benefits, because any path which goes through two financial benefits, and you're into some degree of double counting. And therefore, if you gave them all financial values, it would just be crazy. And it actually distorts behaviors, and it distorts the whole process. I feel I'm not explaining this terribly well. It's often best, which is how I've done it in my book in the chapter, with an example, quite a detailed example. But I have had experience of dealing with CFOs. I remember one that came on one of my one-day seminars, and he started very much with this tack, if you can't put a financial value on it, forget it. By the end of the day, he was completely converted, and he realized that actually if he wasn't tracking the non-financials in their proper way, then he wouldn't get the financial value that he needed. And he actually could also see that the portfolio programs in his organization was incorrect because of the double counting effects. And he went back and he actually significantly reduced the size of the portfolio of programs to focus on those that were truly high value. And I've done other workshops with financial officers, and again, they've often started with this view, but soon come to realize that it's quite naive.
Gerald, what value can an organization expect if they decide to adopt benefit realized management for the first time?
Well, I think enormous value. I'd probably just think of it under three kind of headings. First of all, the whole process leads to much greater stakeholder engagement, which also leads to often better solutions, so that you get solutions that are really going to deliver the goods. And when I say deliver the goods, I don't mean fancy computer systems, but actually deliver the business benefits that the business is looking for. So that's one area, and these overlap. I think it should lead to a more effective portfolio. In fact, I've just mentioned this finance director who went back and reviewed the portfolio in the light of what he'd learned about BRM, and actually killed off a number of programs and then refocused resources to those that were high value. So you can get a much more effective portfolio, and then for each project or program within the portfolio, a much higher return on investment. I would typically be looking for 80-85% of potential benefits actually and demonstrably achieved, as opposed to what typically happens today, according to all the statistics, which is somewhere between 10 and 25% of potential benefits for the majority of programs. So I would expect a much higher return to the organisation from their overall investment in change.
Gerald, where can people learn more about benefits realization management?
I mean, firstly, I would point to my book, which is entitled Benefit Realization Management. It's published by Gower. Its subtitle is A Practical Guide to Achieving Benefits Through Change. It's in its second edition and second printing of that second edition, and it is, I think, become regarded as the almost the standard textbook on benefit realization. We also run regular one-day seminars at the Institute of Directors, which we do one covering most of what I've described, but in a lot more detail, but also giving practical work on mapping, and then a second more advanced mapping, but with a lot more work on measurement and measuring. There's also another book that I've written, which is an MSP companion guide, which is entitled Fundamentals of Benefit Realization. That's a shorter book, but it has got a lot of the essentials in it, not so many case examples and other considerations, but it's got the fundamentals there. And information on all of those is available through our website, and my Gower book can be purchased at a very significant discount through the website if people are interested in that.
And that website address is?
It's www.sigma-uk.com, C-O-M.
Gerald, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for sharing some of your insights.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been very enjoyable to go through these and to be challenged by some of the questions. So thank you.
You have just listened to another business transformation podcast from CXO Transform. To discover more on how companies can achieve successful digitally enabled business transformation, visit www.cxotransform.com for free resources.